The fog rolling off the cairngorms was so thick it felt like driving through wet, grey sheets. By 2:15 a.m., Alastair's eyes were stinging with exhaustion. He had been driving for 9 hours from London to Inverness. Realizing it was unsafe to continue down the pitch-black dual carriageway, he pulled off the A9 road into a dreary, semi-abandoned service station. The structure formed a wide U-shape, with every room door opening directly onto a cracked tarmac car park. A solitary, amber security light flickered violently in the corner. The front office was shielded by thick perspex glass. An elderly clerk with hair the color of static pushed a brass key across the counter. Room 214. Top floor, right at the very end, the clerk murmured. You're the only one up on the terrace tonight. Alastair took his holdall from the boot, locked his saloon car, and climbed the rusted iron staircase. The room smelled intensely of damp carpet. The air inside was stiflingly hot, but the radiator made such a horrible metallic clanking noise that he shut the valve down completely. He locked the deadbolt, drew the faded curtains, and lay down with the television on low volume. He had been drifting off for 20 minutes when a violent argument started in room 212 next door. Through the thin walls, Alastair could hear muffled voices. One was deep and aggressive, while the other was a high-pitched woman's voice pleading for mercy. However, Alastair soon noticed something deeply unsettling. The timing between the voices was mechanically perfect. There was absolutely no human overlap or interruption. He muted his TV and pressed his ear to the wallpaper. The deep voice spoke, "You shouldn't have looked inside." Exactly 2 seconds later, the high voice replied, "Please, I didn't mean to." A wave of dread crashed over him. The high-pitched voice wasn't a woman at all, it was a man fiercely straining his throat to mimic a female pitch. It was a single man sitting alone in the dark, having a theatrical argument with himself. Suddenly, the dialogue stopped. Thud. 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 3 slow knocks vibrated through the wall right beside Alastair's headboard. A playful, sing-song whisper bled through the electrical socket, "I can hear you breathing in there, neighbor." Alastair scrambled backward. Then, he heard the heavy click of the adjacent door opening outside. Footsteps approached on the concrete balcony and stopped outside his window. Alastair crept to the window and peered through a tiny, half-inch gap where the curtains didn't meet the wall. A human eye was staring straight back at him. A manic face was pressed completely flat against the glass. The moment Alastair recoiled, the man began knocking on the glass, rapidly switching between exaggerated, terrifying personas. He chirped like a French maid, boomed in an American drawl, and whimpered like an old woman. Terrified, Alastair grabbed the landline and called the reception desk. Hearing the heavy banging through the phone, the clerk agreed to come up right away. The madman heard the manager's approach and speed-walked back into room 212. The clerk escorted Alastair downstairs to room 102, directly behind the office and facing his parked car. Alastair barricaded the door with a heavy wooden chair and sat awake, clutching a heavy silver tire iron. An hour passed. Just as exhaustion pulled him down, a soft, synthetic brushing sound caught his attention outside. He parted the fabric of the window curtain by a fraction of an inch. It was the same man. He had come downstairs. He wasn't knocking or talking anymore, he was simply pacing back and forth in a slow, perfectly straight line. Every time he passed the glass, he turned his head at a sharp, unnatural angle, staring into the room with wide, completely hollow eyes. Alastair sat paralyzed, watching that silent silhouette pace until the sun finally broke over the hills. The summer road trip was supposed to be a celebratory getaway before university. It was an all-female trip, Chloe, her 2 younger sisters Eleanor and Megan, her mother Sarah, and her elderly grandmother, Evelyn. An unexpected engine malfunction with their estate car in North Devon had delayed them for hours. By 11 p.m., the rain was lashing down, and the winding coastal roads were completely blinded by mist. They pulled into the gravel car park of the Anchor Reef Motel, a bleak concrete block facing the wild Atlantic Ocean. Chloe and Eleanor ran through the downpour into the tiny lobby to check in. While waiting, Chloe's mobile rang. It was her mother calling from the car. "We're in room 14 and room 16 on the upper deck." Eleanor shouted loudly into the phone, her voice echoing across the bare lobby walls. Chloe felt a sudden prickle of awareness on her neck. Standing perfectly still at the glass entrance doors was a man wearing a wet, black fisherman's jumper. He had no luggage and was staring directly at Eleanor. He had clearly heard their room numbers. As they walked past him, he gave them a slow, terrifyingly wide grin. By 11:30 p.m., the family was settled. Room 14 housed the sisters, while room 16, separated by an empty room 15, belonged to their mother and grandmother. Anxious, Chloe went down to the ground floor to get a bottle of water from the vending machine near a closed-down indoor pool. Hearing a low whisper from the shadows, she shone her phone torch. Sitting in a plastic chair in the dark corner was the man in the black jumper, whispering rapidly into a mobile phone. The second the light hit his face, he stopped and flashed that same vacant grin. Chloe dropped her bottle and sprinted back up the concrete stairs, locking the deadbolt of room 14. Moments later, a frantic banging erupted on their door. It was their mother, Sarah, pale and gasping for breath. "Pack your things right now," Sarah whispered. "I went out to the balcony to drop some rubbish. That man was standing flat against the wall right beside my door, listening. When I gasped, he calmly took out a set of keys, unlocked room 15 right between us, and walked inside." The sisters moved with frantic, silent speed. They grabbed their bags, woke up Grandma Evelyn, and slipped out onto the rainy walkway. Sarah hurried to the office to demand a refund, while Chloe escorted the girls to the car. Looking back, Chloe saw the man in the black jumper step out of an elevator, his eyes fixed entirely on them. Down in the gravel car park, a second nightmare was unfolded. Another man, wearing a yellow oilskin coat, was systematically pressing his face against the windows of the parked cars, jiggling the door handles violently. The man in the yellow coat spotted them. He turned toward the motel lobby, raised his hand, and made a sharp tilting motion with his head, a clear signal. Instantly, the glass doors swung open. The man in the black jumper stepped out onto the wet gravel, accompanied by a third, incredibly tall man carrying a heavy iron tire lever. All three began walking in a synchronized, aggressive line directly toward the family's car. "Get in!" Chloe shrieked. They scrambled into the estate car just as Sarah came running back from the abandoned office. The engine roared to life. The three men were now less than 15 yards away, their paces breaking into a stride. Sarah threw the car into reverse, the tires spitting wet gravel, and mashed the accelerator pedal down, tearing up the dark coastal lane just as the iron bars swung through the air, missing their rear windscreen by mere inches. To appreciate the sheer, unadulterated vulnerability of a traditional British motel, you have to understand how they differ from modern budget hotels. A hotel is a fortress. You pass through a secured main entrance, walk past a manned reception desk, and enter an enclosed corridor protected by security cameras. A motel, however, is entirely exposed. It is bare-bones survival, a single row of brick units where your room door is the only barrier separating your sleeping body from the open world outside. If someone stands on the concrete walkway outside your room, they are not just in a hallway, they are standing in the wild, open night air, right against the glass of your window. My partner, Jessica, and I were on the tail end of a grueling 14-hour drive back from a family gathering in West Wales down to our flat in Southampton. It was late autumn, the air was bitterly cold, and by 1 a.m., the exhaustion was settling into my bones like lead. My eyelids were drooping violently, and the cat's eyes on the dark asphalt of the A31 highway were beginning to blur into a single, hypnotic line. The heater in our old saloon car was blowing dry, stuffy air that only made my head feel heavier, and the radio had dissolved into nothing but static and late-night shipping forecasts. "Daniel, you're drifting," Jessica murmured sleepily from the passenger seat, her voice muffled by her thick woolen scarf. "Please pull over. There's a place up ahead on the map. It doesn't look like much, but you're going to fall asleep at the wheel." She had found a small, independent establishment tucked back into the dense tree-line of the New Forest called the Bramblewood Lodge. It was situated nearly a mile off the main dual carriageway down an unlit, single-track lane bordered by ancient, twisted trees. Jessica used the last remaining bars of her phone battery to quickly book a room online using a budget travel application before her screen flickered and died completely, plunging the car. Interior back into darkness. When we pulled into the gravel car park, the silence of the forest was absolute. The motel was an old, single-story, L-shaped brick building with a dark tiled roof that looked like it hadn't been maintained since the late 1970s. There wasn't a single car in the car park. The entire place looked utterly dead, save for a dim yellow bulb illuminating the small reception office at the short end of the L. The surrounding woodland seemed to press in on the property, its thick canopy blocking out whatever faint starlight the autumn clouds had spared. "I'll go and grab the keys," I said, leaving the engine running for a moment so the car would stay warm while Jessica groggily rubbed her eyes in the passenger seat. Inside the office, a middle-aged woman with tired, hollow eyes and a faded knitted cardigan sat behind a chipped wooden counter. A tiny, portable television was flickering silently on a shelf behind her, casting a pale blue glow over her face. She looked genuinely startled when the bell above the door chimed, her shoulders tensing up instantly. Despite her obvious fatigue, she gave me a polite, weary smile and handed over a heavy brass key attached to a triangular plastic fob. "Room 6, she said quietly, her voice barely louder than a whisper. "Right at the far end of the wing, next to the tree line. Drive your car right up to the door so you don't have to carry your bags through the damp. Have a restful night, sir." I thanked her, walked back out into the freezing night air, and drove the car down to the very end of the brick row. Room 6 was completely isolated, bordered on the right side by a dense, impenetrable wall of ancient oak trees and thick bramble bushes that clawed at the edge of the tarmac. We hauled our small weekend bags inside. The room was standard for a cheap, roadside motel, a creaking double bed with a faded floral duvet, a tiny bathroom with a cracked linoleum floor that smelled faintly of bleach. And old water pipes, and a thin, drafty single-pane window overlooking the dark forest outside. As Jessica immediately collapsed onto the bed, completely spent and wrapping her coat tightly around her shoulders, I searched through my canvas holdall for my phone charger. My stomach sank when I realized the cable wasn't in the bag. I had left the white USB lead plugged directly into the car's dashboard console after using it for navigation earlier in the evening. "I'll be right back, Jess." "Left the charger in the car," I murmured, turning toward the door. She let out a faint, incoherent grunt of acknowledgement from the pillows, already half asleep and entirely defeated by the long journey. I stepped out of the room, leaving the heavy wooden door cracked open by a mere inch, a subconscious habit to ensure I wouldn't lock myself out in the freezing cold, as these old mortise locks had a tendency to click shut automatically if the handle was turned. The saloon car was parked barely 5 yards away from the threshold. I unlocked it with the key fob, the orange hazard lights flashing twice, momentarily illuminating the dense, wet woods around me with a harsh, artificial glare. The moment I closed the car door with the wire in my hand, I noticed that the main office light at the far end of the property had just been switched off. The manager had gone to sleep. The entire property was now plunged into a pitch-black, silent stillness. There was no traffic on the distant highway, no wind in the trees, and no sound from the forest. It was an unnatural, suffocating quiet. I walked back toward room 6, looking down at the white cable wrapped around my fingers. As I stepped onto the concrete walkway, I froze. A cold, sharp spike of pure adrenaline shot straight to my chest, making my breath hitch in my throat. Standing directly in front of my cracked motel room door was a man. He was incredibly large, not just tall, but possessing a wide, imposing frame that completely filled the narrow walkway and blocked the view of the doorway. He was wearing a heavy, dark green trench coat that extended all the way down to his shins, a garment far too heavy and dramatic for the mild autumn weather. He had his back turned to me, his massive upper body leaning forward slightly, his head tilted toward the 1-inch gap in the door. He was actively preparing to push the door open and step inside the dark room where Jessica was sleeping alone. "Can I help you?" I called out sharply, my voice louder and harsher than intended, cutting through the silence of the forest like a knife. The man froze. He didn't jump or look startled. Instead, He slowly, smoothly turned around to face me, his heavy boots making no sound against the concrete walkway. To my surprise, his face didn't look angry, aggressive, or twisted with malice. He had a remarkably soft, pleasant countenance, and a gentle, completely vacant smile was plastered across his features. When he spoke, his voice was incredibly quiet, airy, and high-pitched, a stark, deeply unsettling contrast to his massive, intimidating physical presence. It sounded like the voice of a nervous child coming out of the body of a giant. Instead of being comforting, the sheer, forced gentleness of his demeanor felt profoundly wrong. "Oh, terribly sorry, neighbor," he murmured softly, his eyes wide, unblinking, and reflecting the pale moonlight. "I didn't mean to startle you. Truly, I didn't. I was just admiring the woodwork on these old doors. Splendid craftsmanship, isn't it? You don't see solid timber like this in the modern establishments." It was past 1:30 a.m. in the middle of an isolated forest, and this giant man was claiming to be inspecting the architecture of a rundown budget lodge. Every single survival instinct in my body was screaming that this man's explanation was a lie, a thin veneer hiding something deeply dangerous. His hands were buried deep inside the large, cavernous pockets of his trench coat, and he made no move to step away from my door. "Right," I said, keeping my distance and tightening my grip on my metal car keys, using them as a makeshift weapon between my knuckles. "Are you staying here?" "Oh, yes," he replied instantly, his voice maintaining that creepy, melodic softness that made my skin crawl. "I'm just up in room 2. Just out for a little midnight stroll to clear my lungs. The forest air is so very crisp tonight, don't you think?" "Well, it's late. We're trying to sleep." "Good night," I said flatly, stepping forward with forced confidence. I brushed past him, making sure my shoulder didn't touch his massive frame, and grabbed the brass handle of room 6. "Sleep well, Daniel," he whispered softly as I pushed the door open. A wave of cold dread washed over me, completely freezing my muscles for a split second. I had checked in alone. I had not spoken to him before. I had never told him my name. I slammed the heavy door shut, threw the deadbolt into place, and slid the safety chain across the track. My heart was pounding so hard I could hear it in my ears. Jessica was already snoring softly on the bed, completely oblivious to the horror on the other side of the wall. I stood directly behind the door, pressing my ear flat against the cold, painted wood, holding my breath until my lungs burned. I waited to hear the sound of his heavy boots walking back down the concrete path toward room 2. Nothing. There was absolute, dead silence on the walkway that a suffocating panic began to crawl up my throat. Was he still standing out there, mere inches from where I was breathing? I had to know. Dropping down onto my hands and knees to avoid casting a shadow through the thin curtains, I crawled across the threadbare carpet toward the window. I carefully, delicately parted the heavy fabric of the curtain by a fraction of an inch, peering out at a sharp angle toward our doorstep. He was still there. The man in the trench coat was standing perfectly upright, facing our door. He was staring directly at the brass lock mechanism, his face completely expressionless now, the smile gone. His body was entirely motionless, like a terrifying monument built in the dark. He wasn't moving, he wasn't checking a phone, and he wasn't looking around. He was simply standing there, having an intense, silent staring contest with the barrier protecting us. I lay flat on the cold floor, watching him through the tiny crack. 5 minutes passed. 10 minutes. My limbs were growing stiff from the cold air leaking through the window frame, but I couldn't look away. He didn't move a single muscle. Realizing I couldn't handle this psychological torture alone, I crawled back to the bed and vigorously shook Jessica's shoulder. "Jess, wake up. Wake up right now, but stay completely quiet," I whispered frantically into her ear. "Daniel, what's wrong?" she mumbled, blinking sleepily in the darkness of the room. "There's a giant man in a trench coat standing right outside our door. He's been standing there for 10 minutes just staring at it. I need you to look so you know I'm not making this up." Jessica saw the absolute terror in my face and realized I wasn't joking. She slid off the mattress, her expression tightening with fear. Together, we crawled across the carpet back to the window. I pointed to the tiny gap in the curtain. Jessica leaned forward, took a shallow breath, and peered out into the dark night. She froze for a second, squinting into the darkness, then turned her head toward me with a puzzled look. "Daniel, there's no one there. The walkway is completely empty." "What?" "Look harder." I whispered, pushing past her to look through the glass myself. The concrete doorstep was indeed empty. The man had vanished from the front of the door. But as my eyes adjusted to the pale moonlight filtering through the trees, I scanned the wider car park. "Daniel, look across the tarmac." "Look at the edge of the woods," Jessica whispered, her voice cracking as she pointed a trembling finger toward the tree line. I pressed my face against the cold glass and looked. Across the open gravel space, standing right at the edge of the dense, pitch-black forest, a pale white face was illuminated by the moonlight. The man in the trench coat was standing inside the bushes, his massive body partially obscured by the thick brambles. He was facing our window, his head tilted slightly to the side. The exact moment he realized I had made eye contact with him through the dark glass, he slowly lifted a single, large hand out of his trench coat pocket and gave me a slow, rhythmic, mechanical wave. He knew we were watching him. He had been waiting in the shadows for us to look. I yanked the curtains completely shut, my hands trembling so violently I could barely grip the fabric. I ran over to the wall bracket near the bathroom, snatched up a heavy metal fire extinguisher, and set it squarely beside the bed. "We aren't sleeping tonight," I told Jessica, who was now crying silently on the mattress, clutching her knees to her chest. "We wait until dawn, and then we get out of here." We sat awake in the pitch darkness for 3 excruciating hours, listening to every creak of the old building. At around 3:45 a.m., we heard a faint, terrifying sound, the slow, deliberate scraping of synthetic fabric against the exterior brickwork of our room, right beneath the window sill. Someone was crouching directly outside the glass, listening to the quiet sounds inside that we didn't move. We didn't speak. We held each other in absolute, petrified silence until the morning sun finally filtered through the thin curtains at 06:30 a.m. The moment the sky turned a safe, bright gray, I unlocked the door with the fire extinguisher raised in my right hand. The walkway was empty. We threw our bags into the saloon car, and I practically marched down to the reception office, slamming the keys onto the wooden counter. The woman from the night before looked up, startled by my aggression. "Sir. Is everything all right?" "The man in room 2, I said, my voice thick with anger, terror, and exhaustion. "The giant in the green trench coat. He spent the entire night stalking our room, standing outside our door, and hiding in the woods watching us. He even knew my name. You need to call the police and do something about your guests." The woman's face turned an ash-gray color. She pulled up her computer monitor, her fingers trembling over the keyboard as she scrolled through the lodge's database. "Sir," she whispered, her voice cracking with genuine horror as she looked up at me. "You must be mistaken. I haven't checked anyone into room 2 in over a week. In fact, you and your partner were the only guests registered on the entire property last night. There shouldn't be anyone else out there." Jessica and I didn't say another word. We turned around, ran to our car, and tore out of that forest car park, leaving the gravel spraying behind us. As we hit the safety of the main dual carriageway, the terrifying reality finally settled in. The man in the trench coat hadn't been a guest at all. He was someone, or something, that lived in the deep, dark corners of the New Forest, and if I hadn't gone back out to fetch that phone charger, the cracked door would have given him exactly the invitation he was waiting for.